All right, this session has some of the most fun stuff to me.
Yay!
Yay!
I'm checking it.
In this session, we're going to talk about the evidentiary proof with respect to biology and zoology. We'll talk about proof with respect to the universe. We'll talk about medical knowledge, public health, and well-being in ancient times, and natural science. Now, all of this is, if we can get through this in 45 minutes, and this is a big chapter, so it may take us a little longer than 45 minutes to get through it. All right, there is a statement that was made by Johannes Kepler. He's a German astronomer, and what he said was that science is simply thinking God's thoughts after him.
I like that.
He realizes how much science relies on God for the truth, and he knew that. He was a German astronomer who discovered the three major laws of planetary motion. I remind you of the fact that the book 100 Years of Nobel Prizes discusses Nobel Prize winners from 1901 to 2000, and only 11% of the Nobel Prize winners did not claim to be atheists or agnostics. Now, what we've learned is there were much higher percentage, well over the 90s, in the percentage of chemists, physicists, medical persons who did believe in God. So what we can assume from that, I think, is that most of those who did not believe in God were liberal arts kinds of people who didn't live close to God in their work every day.
Yep.
And I think that, that's an important thing to think about. We talked about there being a lot of obsolete science. We talked about 3.5 miles of obsolete books in the Louvre alone. 3.5 miles of books. And the Louvre probably doesn't have all the obsolete science books that there are. So we know there's a lot of obsolete science. So you have to be careful of the science you rely on in order to prove the truth of a statement. And then you need to think about the fact that something that Alan Sandage, a prominent astronomer, said, the world is too complicated in all its parts and interconnections to be due to chance alone.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. So like I said, we're going to talk about these areas: biology, medical knowledge, natural science, end times, and that sort of thing. Let's talk about some principles of biology. We'll talk about Adam and Eve. We'll talk about the chemical nature of flesh. Remember, the Bible says, from dust to dust. There'll be some proofs of that. We'll talk about like-kind biology, where only like kinds can produce other like kinds.
Yeah.
And this goes against the evolutionary thinking.
Yeah. Whoa.
Talk about circumcision and blood clotting in infants. You remember that Abraham was told that an infant is to be circumcised on the 8th day. We'll talk about why the 8th day rather than the 3rd day or the 5th day or the 10th day. And there's a scientific reason. It was only determined in the last 100 and 150 years as to why that happened. We'll talk about life being in the blood. We'll talk about how blood was let through, bloodletting through the ages. And they only fairly recently learned, that all our nutrients are distributed throughout our body with the blood, that all the waste is taken out of our cells by blood. They didn't know that for a long time. And then, one blood, all nations. It used to be thought that each race had a different blood type. I've only recently learned that ain't so. And it was science that proved that to be accurate. And then there's the seed of life. We'll talk about how the seed of life is from women and not men, which is something they used to think was not the case. And we'll talk about that. And as you recall in Genesis, the Lord says, I'm going to put enmity between your seed, meaning Eve's seed, and your seed meaning the Satan seed and Eve's seed. So we'll talk about that. All right, let's talk about elements of the Earth's crust. The ancient world knew only 10 chemical elements. They were antimony, copper, gold, iron, lead, mercury, silver, sulfur, tin, and zinc. Other elements in the human body and in the earth were not discovered until between 1755 and 1886. Now, we've got a list of elements that are found in the human body and also found in the Earth's crust. I didn't put the whole chart up there. You can find that chart in chapter 7. But the overlap of elements is astounding.
It is.
Every element in the human body is found in the Earth's crust.
Yeah.
Every element in the human body goes back to dust when it dies. And that's what's found in the Earth's crust. Okay. Almost 90% of the human body is made up of 6 elements: oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, calcium, and phosphorus. None of these 6 primary elements, except carbon, were discovered until almost the 18th century. Over 2,500 years after Ecclesiastes and over 3,000 years after Genesis, both of which talk about from dust back to dust. Phosphorus was not discovered until 1669. Hydrogen until 1766, nitrogen 1772, oxygen 1774, and calcium 1808. This is pretty cool stuff when you think about, they already said from dust to dust. Researchers at the National Aeronautics and Space Administration at the Ames Research Center, almost 3,000 years after Ecclesiastes was written, confirmed that every element in man can be found in the soil, prompting one of their scientists to say, the biblical scenario for the creation of life turns out to be not too far off the mark. So they've admitted that. All right. Let's talk about like-kind biology. We know that in Genesis, it talks about producing trees from like kind, producing animals from like kind, that sort of thing. The idea of like kind was not always agreed to by the thinking world. But long before there was scientific proof, the Bible described the development of legal organisms from other living organisms. The phrase "according to their kinds" occurs repeatedly in the Bible. But this was something that was not agreed to by science. For instance, Aristotle believed that living things could spontaneously come into being from non-living matter. And Aristotle was thought well of by the ancient world and by even the medieval world. So it was not until 1858 that a scientist came up with the counter-hypothesis that life can only come from life, that is, biogenesis. What Aristotle came up with was called abiogenesis. That is, not like kind from like kind. You could make, something alive from anything at all that you wanted to. So it was over 3,000 years after the principle was stated in the Bible of like kind that science finally came up with the answer that said it had to be like kind. It couldn't be what Aristotle believed it was. So the probability of life originating by accident is one of the principles of evolution. And I've got some comparables up there that you might want to think about. It's comparable to the probability of the unabridged dictionary resulting from an explosion in a printing shop. And Professor Edward Conklin, he died in 1952, was a Princeton biologist. It's comparable to the probability of a 747 airplane resulting from a tornado in a junkyard.
Oh boy.
It's comparable to car parts in a washing machine resulting in car. is comparable to logs dropped off a cliff resulting in a house. It is just so far-fetched that under Occam's razor, you can't believe it. It's not the simplest explanation for how we're here and how we are what we are. Evolution has not been proven. The theories of evolution, though, agree on several things. First thing they agree on is that there was no life in the universe, including Earth, to begin with. The second thing they agree on is that neither proteins or nucleic acids can exist without the other. And yet there are proteins and nucleic acids in the human body. So how did the human body evolve from something else? In every creature there are proteins and nucleic acids. How do they, come together at the same time for that organism to live? The probability of a living cell or a molecule protein to come into being all by itself is absolutely nil. Scientists have proven this, that a living cell or a molecule cannot come into being all by itself. Laboratory experiments have failed to prove the genetic mutation can lead to the creation of an altogether different species. Can't prove it in the laboratory. The mutation, with rare exceptions, leads to a less effective, less efficient being. If, in order for mutation to work, which evolution basically is, you would have to have changes in forms that were successively better and better and better. And they haven't been able to prove that. The mutated offspring of being better than their parents is not a common phenomenon. No one has ever seen it happen. And if it were a real process, you would think that you would see these transitional forms in the fossil record, and you don't see that. There are unbridgeable gaps between kinds. You can't mate something of one kind with another kind, and in most cases end up with something else. Now there is the mule, but the mule is mating between two kinds, I think, in the same species or genus. Anyway, but it's a very rare thing, and it's a constant thing, where if something mates between two kinds, it will develop something that cannot further mate. The mule cannot have baby mules. It just dies off. So you've got that. Okay. If it were real, evolution should occur, and you would see the transitional forms. We talked about that. And then there's a common claim that evolution goes too slowly to see. But if there are, with billions of fossils, you would think that you would see some of the transitional forms, something, and they couldn't find anything. So there is lack of any tangible evidence that evolution is actual, that it's real. And because of that, that supports the position that God exists and that God created the world. Occam's razor. It's the easiest answer to everything.
Come on.
All right. And then let's talk about circumcision at 8 days old, as God told Abraham to do. Why 8 days? Well, there is a enzyme called prothrombin that is at its highest point in the human body at 8 days, at exactly 8 days. But prothrombin was not discovered, not even guessed at, until 1872, over 3,000 years after Abraham was told to do it. And then prothrombin relies on vitamin K to be effective. And vitamin K was not discovered until 1929, even longer. So how did Abraham, a shepherd, how could he have said of his own thinking, I'm going to circumcise this child at 8 days? He wouldn't have known that. It had to come from a third place.
God.
All right. And then life is in the blood.
Yes.
And you know, that was stated in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. But it wasn't confirmed until 1616.
Oh.
William Harvey, an English physician, discovered blood circulation in 1616. Again, that's about 3,000 years later. How did the writer of Leviticus know to put that information in there? It had to be from God. But the implications of this fact were not fully appreciated for another 250 or so years after he discovered it. And during all this time, there was a process called bloodletting. They didn't realize how important blood was, and people died from bloodletting. This is some of the instruments they used. In fact, in the beginning, bloodletting began with the Egyptians, and they would use thorns to open up a vein to let your blood out. Later it developed into this. Later it developed into more medical-looking tools. But still, bloodletting went on into the 19th century, despite what Harvey found in 1616. People just weren't listening to their Bible. They just had forgotten that fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom.
Amen.
Now, there was bloodletting that the Jews did, but they did it in a very reduced fashion and only for certain conditions. And there is some bloodletting today, but it's not a general practice. There were tens of thousands of people who were bloodlet every year in France into the middle of the 19th century. That is not a full realization that the life is in the blood. Then there's one blood, all nations. We talked about that a little bit. This was not confirmed until the 20th century. It had been stated in Acts by Luke. Now, for a long time, until the 20th century, they thought the different races had different blood types. But Luke put this in Acts. Luke, a doctor, put this in Acts at a time when they thought each race had a different blood type. Now, if he were writing this himself, he wouldn't have put that in there. He would have put in each race has a different blood type. He got this from God, that there's one blood. Now, that was confirmed in the 20th century. It was confirmed that, you know, the same blood types are pretty evenly distributed across the different races. Now, let's talk about the seed of life coming from women. This is really pretty interesting. You know, in Genesis, it talks about the snake, and it talks about Eve's seed, and he'll put enmity between the snake's seed and Eve's seed. But this fact that life came from the seed of women was not proven until about 1660, maybe 1670. In the beginning, they thought that women just contributed brute matter to the children that were born. Aristotle thought this. He thought that women were just higher grade incubation ovens.
Love that.
And he, you know, in the ancient world, kind of agreed with him for a long time, and it was agreed to into the 1660s and 1670s. But in the 16s and 1670s, they first determined that sexual reproduction came from an egg contributed by the woman and sperm contributed by man. In the beginning, they thought, before that all of the important things in a child came from the man, and that the woman was only there to produce the child. Science has caught up to what the Bible said.
Amen.
And did it in 3,000 years. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is biblical statements as to the universe and the earth's place in it. We're going to talk about time, space, matter, power, and motion. We're going to talk about the Big Bang beginning, the old earth versus the young earth. We're going to talk about the expanding universe. We're going to talk about the number of stars in the heavens. We're going to talk about each star being unique. We're going to talk about singing stars, and we're going to talk about the fact that the earth hangs in space. Now, all of these things were stated in the Old Testament, but they weren't proven until fairly recently. Let's talk about what is required for the universe to exist. Hugh Ross, who was a former atheist turned Christian, he was a scientist, has listed 35 parameters that must each fall within a very narrow range in order to make life possible. Any of them fall outside that range, life is not possible. Now that doesn't suggest to me randomness, as is suggested by people that argue that all of these occurrences were just scientific inevitabilities. That suggests to me design. Somebody designed the universe to meet very specific conclusions. It was as a December 1976 Time magazine article said, for instance, most cosmologists, scientists who study the structure and evolution of the universe, agree that the biblical account of creation, in imagining an initial void, may be uncannily close to the truth. And so we'll talk about some of that. All right. Let's talk about time, space, matter, power, and motion. In the beginning, before science caught up recently, scientists did not think that all 5 of these were in fact existing. They challenged time as a physics prerogative. They challenged motion. They challenged power. But if you'll recall, in Genesis 1, the Lord said, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. When you break this down, every one of the current requirements for physics is found in there. In the beginning, that's time. They didn't think for a long time that time was important to physics. God created, that's power. The heavens, that's space. The earth, that's matter. And the Spirit of God was hovering, motion over the waters. This is kind of important because Aristotle, again, who was relied on by so many people in the ancient world, did not see the connection between motion and time. And it was not realized until 1100 years after Genesis that there was that kind of a connection. But it had been stated in around 1400 BC. Then there's the Big Bang theory. In the beginning, many scientists thought that the universe was infinite, that it was endless. Okay? Some scientists thought that there was ether in it holding up the worlds and the planets. That wasn't true. In, I think, 1929, Edward Hubble calculated that the islands of stars are moving at a tremendous speed away from the Earth. And scientists from that have begun to think that there was a Big Bang at one time. That there was a small singularity, whether it was matter or energy or something that was just crammed together, and at some point it exploded. The thing about that Big Bang is that it proves the statements in the Bible that God was stretching the universe, that God was expanding the universe. And there are statements in the Bible that says God stretched the universe. And it wasn't until 1929 that people began to think the Big Bang was accurate. For a long time, they believed what Aristotle believed, that it was endless. So what you see in the Big Bang is further confirmation of the statements in the Bible that the universe has a beginning, that the universe stretches out. But scientists still think that this could have happened naturally. They don't explain where this singularity came from, whether it was energy or matter. And they don't explain how it was spread, how it began, how the Big Bang happened. The only Occam's razor answer to that is God. You know, if it came from a concentrated ball of matter or energy, who made that matter or energy? That's got to be answered somewhere. And if it was matter and energy or just the Big Bang, who caused that Big Bang? You know, and it's still continuing. So the Big Bang theory also helps to prove the accuracy of the Bible. Then there was Abraham was told that he would not be able to count the stars in the Bible, in the heavens. He was told that his descendants would be as countless as the stars if you can count them. Well, we know that the stars today cannot be physically counted. The visible star element estimates are between 2,500 and 10,000. This is a figure that maybe they would have seen in the ancient world, although there are a lot of catalogs from the ancient world that only show 1,000 stars, not this count that they can have today with telescopes. But scientists today cannot physically count them. If you can count them, is what God said. Scholars prior to Galileo counted 1,000 stars. The Almagest by Ptolemy in Alexandria contains only 1,028 stars. That's all he could count at the time. And that was written in 150 AD. The current estimate of stars, they can't count them, but the current estimate is between 1 septillion and 100 septillion, or 1 sextillion and 100 septillion. That's a lot of stars.
That's a lot of stars.
You know, and so they realize they can't count them, but they came up with a huge figure anyway. Then there was the statement in the Bible that the earth is suspended. All right? That statement was not believed until fairly regularly either. In early times, there were cultures that thought the earth was being held up on the back of a turtle. This was one of their mythical beliefs. There were some cultures that believed, a turtle held up elephants, and it was held up by a snake, and that held up the earth. There's, some Indian cultures that believed the earth was held up by elephants, and that when an elephant would shake itself, that would cause an earthquake. The Greeks believed that Atlas held up the earth. And as I said, until relatively recently, scientists believed that there was ether out there holding up the earth. But it was not until 1887 that they proved there wasn't any ether out there holding up the planets or the stars or the suns. 1887.
Wow.
This was 3,000 years again after it was said in the Old Testament.
Yep.
Again, proving the accuracy of the Old Testament. There was an experiment done by a group in that year. Moses, who was the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter, is credited by many with writing Job. And this is where you'll see some of these statements as to where the earth is held up and that sort of thing. He was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. You would have thought that he wouldn't have made these statements if he'd been thus educated, because the Egyptians believed that there was a god, Geb, the god of the earth, who physically supported the world. But he knew that it hung in space. He'd been told by God that it hung in space, and he put it in the Bible. Then there's the hole in the north, which we'll get to. There is, in space, there's a void. It's called the Boots Void. And you can see it from the northern hemisphere. And the Bible says God placed a void in the north. He placed an empty space in the north. And this is the emptiest place in space that we know of. It has hundreds of thousands of fewer galaxies than the rest of space around us. How do they know to put that in the Old Testament? All right, and we're going to talk about current science. I don't know if I got time to get into this. Ancient Egyptian medicine, Hebrew dietary guidelines, sanitary practices and quarantine, leprosy, Nebuchadnezzar the beast, and emotional health. Let's talk about ancient Egyptian medicine. The ancient Egyptians were thought of as being the best doctors in the world. Kings and queens came from all over the world to, have medical treatments in Egypt. But these are some of the things that the Egyptians did. They would use animal drugs such as donkey, antelope, dog, cat, gazelle, dead mice, and other things to cure various ailments that people suffered from. They used human excreta as medicine. They used mud and moldy bread as ointments and dressings. They used spells and magic curses. They used a mixture of seeds and fly dirt to prevent immoderate crying in babies. They fumigated the womb of women as a cure for all kinds of ailments. They used incense smoke or put incense into the woman to cure these things. They used black calf blood boiled in oil and rattlesnake fat to prevent gray hair. They used donkey tooth crushed in honey to strengthen hair. And there were graves of several small children found that revealed that they had eaten skin mice. All right?
Well, I'm glad I didn't live then.
For sure. But the thing about it is, Moses lived in that society.
Wow.
And you don't find any of that in the Bible. None of it. In fact, you find that the Hebrew sanitary practices were also not practiced in the other cultures. The sanitary practices we find in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. They were told to wash themselves and their clothes in running water, blood touched by a garment, or they had a bodily discharge. They came in contact with another's discharge, or touched a dead human or an animal. They were told to wash uncovered vessels that were in the vicinity of a dead body. They were taught to destroy any vessels if a dead carcass touched it. They were taught to purify in fire and running water items recovered during war. They were taught to bury human waste outside of their camps. They were taught to burn the waste of animals, which was really good. But that was not the thinking back then. And they did not understand germ theory. They didn't understand germ theory until it was confirmed about 1890 by Louis Pasteur. Only then, 3,300 years, 3,200 years after it was stated in the Bible, did they come up with the reason for these sanitary practices of the Hebrews. Sanitary practices that we use today. There's a story told of a Viennese doctor who learned that some of his interns had come in contact after autopsies with dead bodies and then would deliver babies. He felt that the mortality rate of the mothers for the babies delivered after they'd done these autopsy procedures, he saw that it was very high, really high. And so what he did was he instructed his interns, after they were or done with an autopsy, they were to wash their hands in soap and water. And he noticed that the mortality rate of the women that they delivered after that declined steeply. And this was in the early 1800s. The problem is that it didn't spread very well until Louis Pasteur's germ theory was proven. And what would happen is these doctors thought, I'm too much of a gentleman to have to wash my hands in between these procedures. And so for a lot of hospitals, the mortality rate increased or stayed high. And it wasn't until the late 19th century that they began to understand germ theory. Hebrew quarantines. That's something that the ancient world didn't do very much of. I mean, we saw a lot of deaths from the Black Plague because it was the custom at the time when somebody died, you left them in the home. Right? And so more people died because they were near the plague victim. But the Hebrew quarantines are throughout the Old Testament. Perhaps the greatest quarantine of all was in the Passover story when the Jews struck their posts with blood, and all the Jews stayed inside, and it was the Egyptians outside whose children died. That's perhaps the largest quarantine of all. But Moses came up with the law that the Hebrews, the Israelites, were to quarantine for such things as itching disease, killing or touching someone who was killed, a swelling rash or shiny spot on the skin that appears to be more than skin deep, leprosy, which was feared at the time, you would quarantine. What we have is that science was not available at the time these things were written in the Old Testament. They had to be proven thousands of years later. Our next session will be on dinosaurs and dragons, which is one of my favorite topics, and it'll be on people, places, and things. I know some people that may poo-poo the existence of dragons, but I think they exist. I think Job talks about them. I think Job talks about the dragon, and there is proof for why dragons could have breathed fire.